Why were Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella so powerful?
The 1469 marriage of Ferdinand, 1452–1516, and Isabella, 1451–1504, brought previously separate Spanish kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, under their joint control. Together the monarchs went on to rule Spain and expand their realm of influence until Isabella's death in 1504. Ferdinand ruled without his wife thereafter. Theirs was a reign that seemed to have religion on its side. In 1496 Pope Alexander VI conferred upon each of them the title Catholic, as in, Ferdinand the Catholic and Isabella the Catholic. And for good reason, because the kings and queens most well-known acts seem to have been motivated by their beliefs. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who in 1478 established the infamous Spanish Inquisition, a court that imprisoned or killed Catholics who were suspected of not following religious teachings. While the Inquisition was aimed at discovering and punishing Muslims and Jews who had converted to Catholicism but who were thought to be insincere, soon all Spaniards came to fear its power. In 1482 the monarchs undertook a war with the Muslim Moors, conquering the last Moorish stronghold at Granada in 1492, and forcing them back to Africa after 4 centuries of occupation and influence in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. The recovery of Iberia had been motivated by religion, when the king and queen expelled the Moors. They also believed they were expelling Islam from their kingdom. That year, 1492, was a fateful one for the Spanish. Not only were the Moors driven out, but Ferdinand and Isabella also turned their attention to the Jewish threat, expelling them, too. Those who remained went underground with their faith. Those Iberian Jews who migrated spread their division of Judaism, called Sephardim, to North Africa and the Middle East. Most students of history know 1492 best as the year that explorer Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, sailed to the New World. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who sponsored his voyage, believing that the conquered lands would not only add to their authority but would provide new territory for the spread of Catholicism. The Spaniards soon emerged as a formidable sea power in the Atlantic. For all their fervor, Isabella and Ferdinand were also interested in education and the arts, and they sponsored advances in both areas during their reign. Their legacy included their grandson Charles V, 1500–1558, who, through marriage, became Holy Roman Emperor and ruled from 1519 to 1558 as one of the all-powerful Habsburgs.
How were Southern blacks prevented from voting?
Besides intimidation, there were 3 different methods used in southern states in the early part of the century to disenfranchise black citizens: 1. The poll tax, 2. Literacy tests, and 3. Grandfather clauses. The poll tax required a voter to pay a fee in order to exercise the right to vote. Literacy tests were implemented as a prerequisite for voting. This method also kept many poorly educated whites, unable to pass the exam, from casting their ballots as well. Most southern states also adopted legislation by which voting rights were extended only to those citizens who had been able to vote as of a certain date, a date when few if any black men would have been able to vote. Since these laws made provisions for said voters' descendants as well, they were dubbed grandfather clauses. Such attempts to deny citizens the right to vote were made unlawful in 1964, by the 24th Amendment, which outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. In 1965, by the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed measures used to suppress minority votes. And in 1966, when poll taxes at the state and local levels were also declared illegal. Literacy tests and grandfather clauses were also struck down as unconstitutional.
How is someone sainted?
Criteria for sainthood, also called canonization, are leading a holy life, conducting miracles, and suffering or even dying because of one's faith, martyrdom. The Catholic Church keeps a list of saints, from which certain names were dropped in 1969 since their inclusion could not be justified by history.
What is Hinduism?
Hinduism, an ancient religion that originated about 1500 B.C. and developed over thousands of years, encompasses the beliefs and practices of the numerous religious sects of India. Each sect has its own philosophy and form of worship. It is a polytheistic religion believing in many gods as well as in one great God, or universal spirit, called Brahman. Hindu doctrine is centered on sacred scriptures including the Veda, which includes the Upanishads. Dialogues describing sacrificial rituals and religious ceremonies, the Puranas, stories about Hindu gods and goddesses. And the Mahabharata, which contains the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Lord, in which the god Krishna discusses the meaning of life with a warrior prince on the eve of battle. Hindus worship alone at temples, which are dedicated to divinities. Followers also practice yoga, believing that it leads to knowledge and union with God.
Who invented the thermometer?
While the Greeks made simple thermometers as early as the 1st century B.C., it wasn't until Galileo, 1564 to 1642, that a real thermometer was invented. It was an air thermometer, in which a colored liquid was driven down by the expansion of air, so that as the air got warmer, and expanded, the liquid dropped. This is unlike ordinary thermometers in use today, which rely on the colored liquid of mercury to rise as it gets warmer. In 1612, Italian physician Sant'Orio 1561–1636, a friend of Galileo, adapted the device to measure the body's change in temperature due to illness. The clinical thermometer wasn't Sant'Orio's only invention. As the first doctor to use precision instruments in the practice of medicine, Sant'Orio also developed the pulse clock. It was a full century though before thermometers had a fixed scale. This was provided by German physicist Daniel Fahrenheit. 1686 to 1736, who in 1714 invented the mercury thermometer.
What was the Munich Pact?
It was a failed effort to appease the territory and power-hungry German leader Adolf Hitler. 1889 to 1945, in the days leading up to World War II, 1939 to 45. After Germany annexed neighboring Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, it became known that Hitler had designs on the Sudetenland, a heavily German region of Czechoslovakia. With World War I, 1914–18, a fresh memory, and European nations still recovering from heavy losses, Europe's powers were eager to avoid another conflict. On September 29 and 30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich. They were joined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, a German ally, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, a Czech ally. Czechoslovakia did not have any representatives at the conference. The leaders quickly worked out a plan for Germany to occupy the Sudetenland. Chamberlain considered Czechoslovakia's concession a reasonable price to pay for peace on the continent. But the effort to assuage Hitler was not successful. In March 1939, Germany moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. On September 1, Germany marched into Poland, and World War II began.
What is the era?
The era stands for the Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment proposed by Congress in 1972. It stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. In proposing the amendment, Congress gave the states 10 years in which to ratify it. But in 1982 only 35 of the necessary 38 states had approved the amendment, which then died. The failure to ratify the era was the result of disagreement over how the language would be interpreted. Supporters believed the amendment would guarantee women equal treatment under the law. Opponents feared the amendment might require women to forfeit the financial support of their husbands and require them to serve in the military.
How old is tennis?
The game is believed to have originated in France, where it was called jeu de paume, meaning game of the palm, in the 1100s or 1200s. Players hit a small ball back and forth over a net using the palms of their hands. The father of modern tennis is English soldier and sportsman Walter Clopton Wingfield. Known as Major Wingfield 1833 to 1912. Who in 1873 published a rule book for lawn tennis and in 1874 patented equipment for the game.
Were the anthrax attacks acts of terrorism?
Yes, as U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said. When people send anthrax through the mail to hurt people and invoke terror, it's a terrorist act. Investigators believed the attacks, which killed 5 people and sickened 17 others, were acts of domestic terrorism. But whoever was responsible for mailing anthrax spores in the fall of 2001 remained unknown in mid-2005. Some observers believed the attacks were carried out to expose the nation's vulnerability to bioterrorist attacks.
What is the Intifada?
Intifada means uprising in Arabic and refers specifically to 2 recent periods of intense and regular violence between Palestinians and Israelis in the disputed territories of the Middle East. The First Intifada began in 1987 and did not subside until a peace settlement was brokered between the 2 sides in Oslo, Norway, in 1993. The Second Intifada began in September 2000. The violence of that uprising continued into 2005 despite ceasefire vows from Arab, Palestinian and Israeli leaders. The second wave of violence was marked by almost daily suicide bombings of Israeli targets, including markets, restaurants, buses, and other public places. Israelis view the intifadas as acts of terrorism, claiming the lives of thousands of Israeli citizens. Palestinians in general and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the militant Islamic group Hamas in particular consider the tactics part of their war of national liberation, a decades-long struggle to establish an autonomous Palestinian homeland in Israel. In the waves of violence, casualties were high on both sides. More than 4,000 died in the Second Intifada alone. The cycle of conflict appeared endless. Palestinian acts of violence were met with retaliation from the Israelis, which incited further violence from the Palestinians. Hopes for a lasting peace were raised again in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, 1935, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 1928, held a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They declared a ceasefire agreement and their intentions to resume negotiations, as outlined in the Roadmap for Peace. But the militant Palestinian group Hamas immediately claimed the verbal agreement was non-binding. Indeed, Hamas, which was largely responsible for the Intifada, posed major roadblocks to an end of violence in the region. Before they would put down arms, the group demanded total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Hamas was also dissatisfied with Israel's agreement to release only 900 of the 8,000 Palestinians held prisoner by Israel.
What was the lost colony?
It was the second English colony established in America, set up in 1587 on Roanoke Island. Off the coast of North Carolina, by 1590 it had disappeared without a trace. Theories surround the disappearance, though it is not known for sure what happened. Roanoke Island had also been the site of the first English colony. Set up in 1585 by about 100 men who were sent there by Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618. Raleigh had perceived the island to be a good spot for English warships that were then fighting the Spanish, to be repaired and loaded with new supplies. But the plan was not a success, the land wasn't fertile enough to support both the colonists and the Indians living nearby. And ships could not get close enough to the island since the surrounding sea proved too shallow. The colonists returned to England the following year. Meantime, Raleigh had dispatched another group of colonists from England. They arrived at Roanoke days after the original settlers left. Seeing that the site had been abandoned, all but 15 of the colonists opted to return to England. In spring 1587 Raleigh sent yet another group of colonists to America. But these ships were headed for areas near Chesapeake Bay, farther north, in present-day Virginia. Reaching the Outer Banks in July, the ship's commander refused to take the colonists to their destination and instead left them at Roanoke Island. The colonists' leader, John White, who had also been among the first settlers at Roanoke, returned to England for supplies in August 1587. However, the ongoing war between England and Spain prevented him from returning to the colony until 3 years later. Arriving back at Roanoke in August 1590, expecting to be met by family members and the 100 or so settlers, including some women and children. Instead he discovered that the colony was abandoned. The only clue that White found was the word Croatoan, which had been engraved on a tree. The Croatoan, or Hatteras, were friendly Indians who lived on an island south of Roanoke Island. White set out to see if the colonists had joined the Hatteras Indians. But weather prevented the search and his expedition returned to England instead. Two theories explain what might have become of the lost colonists. Since the shore of Chesapeake Bay was their original destination, the colonists might have moved there but, encountering resistance, perished at the hands of the Indians. Other evidence suggests that the colonists became integrated with several Indian tribes living in North Carolina. Either way, they were never seen again by Europeans.
How frequently have tsunamis occurred throughout the world?
Tsunamis typically occur about every 6 years in the Pacific Ocean, and most often during March, August, and November. Although sometimes called tidal waves, tsunamis are created not by tides but by seismic movements. Earthquakes, which produce chains of waves that move across the water at terrific speeds of more than 500 miles per hour. Upon reaching shallow water, the waves grow in height, sometimes to 100 feet or more. As was the case in 1883 when tsunamis reaching up to 130 feet hit an Indonesian island, destroying more than 150 villages and claiming some 36,000 lives. In ancient times, it is believed that a tsunami destroyed the Minoan Greek culture, that of a people who lived on the island of Crete, in the Mediterranean Sea. In about 1450 BC, Crete was struck by a 200-foot tsunami, which either demolished the island or weakened the population such that they could be taken over by the Mycenaeans, who were Greek mainlanders. While tsunamis are known to strike along the Pacific Rim, damage has been minimized by sophisticated instruments that help meteorologists monitor and predict disastrous weather, alerting the public to evacuate from areas of possible danger. Such systems did not exist for the Indian Ocean when a 9.0 earthquake off the coast of the Indonesian island of Sumatra struck on December 26, 2004.
What was the Virginia Plan?
It was the famous plan, drafted by James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Put forth by the Virginia delegates to the Constitutional Convention, which convened on May 25, 1787. After taking a few days to set the ground rules and elect officers, on May 29 the delegation from Virginia, led by Edmund Jennings Randolph, 1753 to 1813, proposed a plan to write an all-new constitution. Rather than attempting to revise and correct the weak Articles of Confederation, there was opposition, sometimes called the New Jersey Plan, and the issue was debated for weeks. Eventually, a majority vote approved the Virginia Plan and the delegates began work, drafting a document that would provide a strong national government for the United States.
What was the world like between the world wars?
Before World War II began in 1939, World War I, 1914-18, was referred to as the Great War. And understandably so given its enormous impact. The price of the conflict was paid in human casualties. More than 10 million soldiers died and another 20 million were wounded. Civilian deaths were equally devastating, resulting from widespread hunger and flu epidemics. This was in the days preceding the advent of penicillin to treat complications from influenza. During the 1920s, with the death toll of the Great War a recent memory, the civilized world enjoyed a period of relative peace. In the United States, the decade was known as the Roaring Twenties, 10 years of prosperity and even frivolity. Despite ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1919, which prohibited the sale and consumption of intoxicating liquors. At the close of the Great War, the League of Nations had been established to handle disputes among countries and avoid another major conflict. This was followed in 1928 by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, also called the Pact of Paris, in which 15 nations agreed to settle conflicts by diplomacy rather than military might. Eventually 62 nations ratified the agreement. Meanwhile, in Germany an extreme sense of nationalism was taking hold. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the Great War, seriously weakened the nation, allowing the rise of the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. Nazis were determined to see their beloved homeland rise to power once again. And they found a ready following among the German people. In 1929 a general downturn began in the world economy, triggered by the U.S. stock market crash of late October. As the United States fell into the severe and sustained economic crisis known as the Great Depression. Other industrialized nations including Germany also felt the impact. Unemployment jumped to record levels in many countries, and a lack of social welfare programs resulted in the destitution of numerous families. Politicians and economists alike searched for solutions to the crisis, many turning to anti-free trade or isolationist policies to protect their own. Meanwhile, post-war efforts to keep peace were proving ineffective. Japan invaded Manchuria, China. In 1931, Italy conquered Ethiopia. In 1936, civil war raged in Spain, 1936–39. India became the site of a bitter struggle between British rulers and Indian nationalists, and the Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and would be absorbed by the outbreak of World War II, was fought in Asia. A dangerous alliance was forged when Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the Axis powers in 1936. Also, by 1933, Germany had become a totalitarian state known as the Third Reich. In 1938 Nazi armies took their first steps toward gaining supremacy when they marched into Austria and claimed it, setting the stage for World War II, 1939–45.
How old is nationalism?
Nationalism, a people's sense that they belong together as a nation because of a shared history and culture, and often because of a common language and/or religion, emerged at the close of the Middle Ages, 500–1350. By the 1700s several countries, notably England, France, and Spain, had developed as nation-states. Groups of people with a shared background who occupy a land that is governed independently. As political and economic entities, the nation-states were preceded by fiefs, tribes, city-states, and empires, which overlapped each other as organizing units, dividing people's loyalties. By the 1800s nationalism had become a powerful force, and the view took hold that any national group has the right to form its own state. Because of this belief, called national self-determination, some nations achieved independence, including Greece, which gained freedom from Turkey in 1829, and Belgium, which won self-rule from the Netherlands in 1830. Others formed new, larger countries. Both Italy and Germany were created by the unification of numerous smaller states, Italy in 1870 and Germany 1 year later. And still others carved smaller states out of great empires, for example, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I 1914-18 resulted in the formation of the independent countries of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and, later, Yugoslavia. In the United States, nationalism in the 1800s took the form of manifest destiny. The mission to expand the country's boundaries to include as much of North America as possible. By the end of the century, the United States had claimed all of its present-day territory. While nationalism is a source of pride and patriotism and has had many positive results, some leaders, notably German dictator Adolf Hitler 1889-1945, have carried it to extremes, initiating large-scale movements that resulted in the persecution of other peoples and in the hideous practice of ethnic cleansing. The boundary lines that were drawn on the world map at the end of the 20th century were largely the result of nationalistic movements, some of which had resulted in conflicts and some of which remained unresolved.
How old is the compass?
The first compass dates back to the 1st century B.C., when the Chinese observed that pieces of lodestone, an iron mineral, always pointed north when they were placed on a surface. There is evidence that Arab sailors were using compasses as early as AD 600, and as Arab influence spread north into Europe, so did the compass. By the 14th century, European ships carried maps that were charted with compass readings to reach different destinations. Portugal's Prince Henry, 1394-1460, also called Henry the Navigator, advanced the use of compasses in navigation by encouraging sailors and mapmakers to coordinate their information to make more accurate maps of the seas. Also in the 15th century, an important observation was made by none other than Genoese navigator and explorer from Spain Christopher Columbus, 1451-1506. Who noticed that as he sailed to the New World, his compass did not align directly with the North Star. The difference between magnetic north and true north is called declination. In the 16th and 17th centuries, scientists began to better understand Earth's magnetic fields. American Elmer Sperry, 1860 to 1930, built the first gyro compass. A device that works day or night, anywhere on Earth, even at the poles. Where lines of force are too close together for magnetic devices to function properly. When the gyro compass is pointed north, it holds that position. Before the compass, which simply indicates north by a means of a magnetic needle or needles that pivot. Sailors used the sun, the moon, and the stars to determine direction and navigate their ships.
What were the sentences in the Beltway sniper cases?
The October 2002 shootings that left 10 people dead and 3 critically injured in the Washington, D.C. area set off a flurry of legal activity, which was still underway 3 years later. 2 men had been found guilty by juries in separate trials in Virginia in late 2003, John Allen Muhammad, born John Allen Williams 1960-, was sentenced to death, and accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo, aka John Lee Malvo 1985-, received life imprisonment without parole. Since he was a minor at the time of the shooting spree, the death penalty could not be applied in his case. In October 2004, under a plea deal in 2 other Beltway sniper cases, Malvo received other sentences of life imprisonment without parole and 8 years on gun charges. Muhammad and Malvo were arrested on October 24, 2002, in connection with the Beltway sniper attacks. The random shootings, which terrified suburban Washington and gripped the nation, began with a killing in a grocery store parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, on the evening of October 2. Within the next 16 hours there were 4 more shootings and 4 more dead. By October 22 there were 8 more sniper shootings, 3 of the victims survived. People were targeted as they went about their daily busyness, pumping fuel outside gas stations, loading parcels into their cars in parking lots, arriving at school, and crossing streets. Tips led investigators to issue federal warrants for Muhammad's and Malvo's arrests on October 23, 2002. They were taken into custody early the following morning at a rest stop in Maryland. The 2 men faced charges in several states as well as the District of Columbia. In addition to Virginia and Maryland, the pair had been tied to crimes in the state of Washington, where their journey had begun, as well as in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. In 2005, with Malvo behind bars for life and Malvo awaiting a death sentence, prosecutors still wanted the 2 tried in other cases, as insurance against reversals on appeals and as closure for the families of victims. But legal analysts questioned the high price of further trials, defense costs alone for Muhammad and Malvo, who received court-appointed, and publicly paid, defenders, were expected to near $1 million. The highly publicized sniper shootings added strength to the gun control lobby. According to federal law, neither Muhammad nor Malvo could buy firearms. The weapon they used in their deadly spree was shoplifted from a Tacoma, Washington, gun store. The store owner and the gun manufacturer were named in a civil suit by the legal action. Project of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence on behalf of the victims and their families. In 2004, a $2.5 million settlement was reached in the case.
What was the Code Napoleon?
In 1800, just after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, had come to power in France. He appointed a commission of legal experts to consolidate all French civil law into one code. The process took 4 years. The so-called Code Civil went into effect on March 21, 1804, the same year that Napoleon named himself Emperor of France, which he did in December. The laws thus took on the alternate name of the Code Napoleon or Napoleonic Code. It went into force throughout France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and in other French territories and duchies in Europe. The code represented a compromise between Roman law and common, or customary, law. Further, it accommodated some of the radical reforms of the French Revolution, 1789–99. The Code Civil set forth laws regarding individual liberty, tenure of property, order of inheritance, mortgages, and contracts. It had broad influence in Europe as well as in Latin America, where civil law is prevalent. As opposed to the common law of most English-speaking countries. Civil law judgments are based on codified principles, rather than on legal precedent. For example, under the Code Civil, an accused person is guilty until proven innocent. As opposed to common law, which holds that a person is innocent until proven guilty.
How old is the oldest illuminated manuscript?
The oldest painted manuscript known is the Vatican Virgil, which dates to the early 5th century A. D. The content is pagan, representing a scene from Roman poet Virgil's 70 to 19 BC. Georgica, his verses idealizing country life and nature. But illuminated manuscripts were typically renderings of sacred texts. When the fathers of the Eastern Church advised that pictures could be used in books and art to teach people, the decorations and pictures, called illuminations since they were meant to illuminate, or make clear, the text, took on great importance.
What is common law?
It is the system of justice that prevails in Great Britain and the United States, except Louisiana, where the precedents, past decisions, of the courts are used as the basis of the legal system. It is sometimes referred to as customary law since justices consider prevailing practices customs, in order to arrive at their decisions. In the U.S., Louisiana is the only state where judges do not rely on precedent or custom to decide private cases, they rely on civil law, the letter of the code, and are free to disregard the decisions of similar cases. In all other states, the precedents must be considered. The exception of Louisiana to the prevailing system of common law is explained by its unique history. It was long a French holding, and that influence is still felt. In many countries, the justice system is a combination of the civil law handed down by the Romans under Justinian and the common law formulated in England. Private cases, often and confusingly called civil cases, are largely the realm of civil law. In other words, the statutes prevail, whereas criminal cases, in which crimes have been committed against society, are the realm of common law, i.e., decisions are based on precedent.
What was populism?
A commoners' movement. In the United States, populism was formalized in 1891 with the founding of the Populist Party, which worked to improve conditions for farmers and laborers. In the presidential election of 1892, the party supported its own political candidate. The former, Third Party, Greenback candidate James B. Weaver. 1833–1912. Though Weaver lost, the Populists remained a strong force. In the next presidential election, of 1896, they backed Democratic Party candidate William Jennings Bryan. 1860–1925, a self-proclaimed commoner who was sympathetic to the causes of the Farmers' Alliances and of the National Grange. Reform-minded agricultural organizations, as well as the nation's workers. Bryan lost to William McKinley, 1843–1901, and soon after the election the Populist Party began to fall apart, disappearing altogether by 1908. Nevertheless, the party's initiatives continued to figure in the nation's political life for the next 2 decades, and many populist ideas were made into laws, including the free coinage of silver and government issue of more paper money, greenbacks, to loosen the money supply. Adoption of a graduated income tax, passage of an amendment allowing for the popular election of U.S. senators. The Constitution provided for their election by the state legislatures, passage of antitrust laws. To combat the monopolistic control of American business, and implementation of the 8-hour workday. Since the early 1900s, political candidates and ideas have continued to be described as populist, meaning they favor the rights of and uphold the beliefs and values of the common people.
Who was Generalissimo Franco?
Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892–1975, was the fascist leader of Spain from 1939 until 1973. He rose to power in the Spanish Civil War, 1936–39, as he led a rebel nationalist army against the loyalist forces. Capturing Madrid in 1939, Franco assumed the role of head of government. Though he and the nationalists had received considerable help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to win the Civil War, when fighting broke out in World War II. 1939–45, Spain stayed neutral, at least nominally so. In 1947, with the fighting in Europe over, Franco declared himself monarch of Spain and ruled as an authoritative dictator. 2 years before he died, he stepped down as head of state. Though he retained the title Generalissimo, meaning commander-in-chief. Franco named as his successor Prince Juan Carlos, 1938. When Franco died in 1975, Juan Carlos I became the first Spanish monarch to control Spain since his grandfather. King Alfonso XIII, 1886–1941, was deposed in 1931 to make way for the brief republic, which was later overthrown by Franco and the nationalists. King Juan Carlos played an important role in transforming Spain into a modern democracy.
Who are the Jesuits?
The Jesuits are members of a Roman Catholic religious order called the Society of Jesus. The group was founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, 1491–1556. Born into nobility as Inigo de Onís y Loyola, the Spaniard became a knight in 1517. In that capacity he fought against the French in their siege 1521 of Pamplona, northeast of Madrid. But he was seriously wounded in the battle and retreated to a commune in northeast Spain from 1522 to 1523. There Ignatius heard a religious calling and subsequently undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, 1523 to 1524. Committed to a religious life, he embarked on a program of disciplined writing and study in Spain and in Paris, France. Even before he was ordained in 1537, Ignatius had gained followers. The Spanish missionary Francis Xavier, 1506–1552, among them. With his companions Ignatius founded the Society of Jesus in 1539, the religious order was approved by Pope Paul III, 1468–1549, the following year. Jesuits are known for leading structured lives and for their self-discipline, commitment to the Pope, and missionary work. They have a profound belief in education, and as such have long been leaders in learning and in the sciences. The order was suppressed in 1773 but restored in 1814.
How old is baseball?
Baseball, America's pastime, is more than 200 years old. According to legend, the sport's originator was U.S. Army officer Abner Doubleday. 1819 to 1893, who was credited with inventing and naming the game in 1839, while he was attending school in Cooperstown, New York, the site of the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. But in 2004 a document was uncovered in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, citing a 1791 bylaw prohibiting the playing of baseball too close to, within 80 yards of, the town's meeting hall. Historians verified the authenticity of the document and its date. This is believed to be the earliest written record of the game, and it establishes that the stick and ball sport was being played 42 years before Doubleday's involvement. Baseball historians have long acknowledged that the sport, which is similar to the English games of cricket and rounders, had not one father, but thousands. Although the 2004 discovery indicates that the game was already in existence in 1791, and popular enough to be the subject of a town ordinance. It was in the 1800s that baseball developed into the game Americans still love today. The first baseball club, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, was organized by American sportsman Alexander Cartwright, 1820 to 1892, in 1842 in New York City. By 1845 the team had developed a set of 20 rules, which included specifications for where the bases are positioned and how runners can be tagged as out. The rules also defined a field of play, outside of which balls are foul. The so-called New York game spread in popularity after a famous 1846 match in Hoboken, New Jersey. By 1860 there were at least 50 organized ball clubs in the country. Union soldiers helped spread the game during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And the popularity of the sport greatly increased during the last 3.5 decades of the 19th century. The first professional baseball team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which began play 1869. In 1876 the National League, NL, was founded. It included teams in Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Ohio, Hartford, Connecticut, Louisville, Kentucky, New York, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, Missouri. By the 1880s the sport had evolved into big business. An 1887 championship series between St. Louis and Detroit drew 51,000 paying spectators. The American League, AL, was formed in 1901, and 2 years later the two leagues staged a championship between their teams. In 1903, the Boston Red Sox beat the Pittsburgh Pirates in the first World Series. An overall increase in American leisure time, created by the innovation of labor-saving household devices as well as a reduction in the average laborer's work week, helped baseball become the national sport and its favorite pastime. Played on an open field, the game harkened back to the nation's agrarian roots. But with its standardized rules and reliance on statistics, it looked forward to a modern, industrialized future.
Why does the music of Bartók figure prominently in concert programs today?
Bela Bartok, 1881 to 1945, is revered today not only for his ability as a pianist. His teacher compared him to Franz Liszt 1811 to 1886, who was perhaps the greatest pianist of the 19th century. But for his compositions, which are steeped in the tradition of Hungarian folk music. Bartók studied and analyzed Hungarian, Romanian, and Arabian folk tunes, publishing thousands of collections of them in his lifetime. While ethnic music had influenced the works of other composers, Bartók was the first to make it an integral part of art music composition. His works were unique in that the folk music provided the sheer essence and substance of the music, lending the compositions a primitive quality. Among his masterpieces are his three stage works, the ballets The Wooden Prince and The Miraculous Mandarin, and the one-act opera Duke Bluebeard's Castle. The introduction of folk music as the core of a musical composition has had far-reaching influence, which must have been felt by American composer Aaron Copland, 1900 to 1990. Whose Appalachian Spring, 1944, features a simple shaker tune, front and center.
Why did the U.S. government send troops after Pancho Villa?
Pancho Villa, 1878 to 1923, was sought by the U.S. government because in 1916 he and his followers attacked Americans on both sides of the border. In 1915 the United States decided it would back the acting chief of Mexico, Venustiano Carranza, 1859 to 1920, even as he faced attacks from two of his fellow revolutionaries, Emiliano Zapata, 1879-1919, and Pancho Villa. 4 years earlier, Villa had himself sought to control Mexico after the fall of President Porfirio Diaz. When the United States cut off the flow of ammunition to the rebels, Villa, who was a fierce fighter, earned himself a reputation as a bandit, seeking revenge on Americans in Mexico by stopping trains and shooting the passengers. In 1916 Villa raided the small New Mexico village of Columbus, where he killed 18 people. The attack prompted President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, to send U.S. soldiers to hunt Villa down and capture him. Though thousands of men were put on the initiative under General John Pershing, 1860 to 1940, they never caught up with the bandit. Wilson withdrew the forces from Mexico after the government there expressed resentment for the U.S. effort, which the Mexican people, President Carranza included, viewed as a meddlesome American interference in the Mexican Revolution, 1910-20. The revolution ended 3 years later, after 10 years of fighting and disorder.
What is King Cotton?
King Cotton was an expression of the mid-1800s. when cotton had become so vital to the economies of southern states that it was said to rule them. Until the 1790s, growers were limited to producing the quantity of cotton that could be processed by slaves. Separating cotton's fibers from its seeds was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. The bolls were dried in front of a fire, and the seeds were picked out by hand. In 1793, American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, introduced the cotton gin. In one day, his machine could clean 50 times as much cotton fiber than could a manual laborer. While Whitney patented the machine in 1794, imitations were nevertheless quickly put into production by shrewd businessmen who observed the effect the gin could have on the nation's cotton industry. There was no shortage of demand for the fiber. Just before Whitney developed the gin, another inventor, British-born Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton, which he introduced at a Rhode Island mill in 1790. As the 1800s dawned, machinery had made cotton the center of the nation's emerging textiles industry. Growers in the South stepped up cotton production to keep up with factories' demands. Slave labor and excellent growing conditions in the southern states, predominantly Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, combined to dramatically increase production. By 1849, cotton exports reached $66 million a year and accounted for roughly 2/5 of total U.S. exports. But cotton came at a dear price. While laborers in the North's textile factories worked under difficult and sometimes dangerous circumstances, in the South cotton crops were planted and harvested by slaves. As abolitionists became increasingly vocal about the immorality of slavery and demanded the U.S. government legislate the abolition of slavery, Southern growers defended the system. Knowing that their livelihoods and the South's economy depended on it. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond, 1807 to 1864, of South Carolina taunted Northern sympathizers, saying, "You dare not make war on cotton, no power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." Hammond was not the first to use the phrase, it was coined 3 years earlier in the title of a book. Cotton's importance to the South contributed to the deepening North-South divide in the nation. By the time the Civil War, 1861–65, began, the southern United States supplied 2/3 of the world's cotton.
What are the basic beliefs of Buddhism?
Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths: existence is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire. Through total transcendence, called nirvana, one may suspend suffering. And to end suffering one must follow a certain path called the Eightfold Noble Path. The path prescribes moral conduct, specifically, 1. Knowing the truth, 2. Resolving to resist evil, 3. Using speech properly so as not to hurt others, 4. Demonstrating respect for life, morality, and property through one's actions, 5. Working in a job that does not harm others. 6. Making an effort to free one's mind of evil. 7. Mindfulness, or controlling one's thoughts and feelings, and 8. Concentration. In some places, the beliefs and practices of Buddhism are combined with those of Hinduism and the Shinto religion.
What was the London Protocol?
The 1830 decree recognized an independent Greek nation. After the 8-year Greek War for Independence, 1821–29. The London Protocol officially ended Ottoman Turk rule of Greece, which had begun almost 400 years earlier. In 1453 the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and they soon moved westward to bring the Greek peninsula under their control as well. By 1456 most of Greece had been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of years later, in 1770, the Greeks tried to overthrow the Turks and were aided in this effort by Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great, 1729–1796. Whose aim it was to replace Muslim rule with Orthodox Christian rule throughout the Near East. But the effort was unsuccessful. And it was 50 years before the Greeks would rise again to assert their independence. On March 25, 1821, the Greeks, led by the Archbishop of Patras, proclaimed a war of independence against the Turks. Soon, Egypt had thrown its military support behind the Turks. But even the combined force could neither defeat the Greeks nor squelch the revolution. In 1827 Britain, France, and Russia, all sympathetic to the Greek cause, came to their aid. In October of that year a combined fleet of the three European powers defeated the Turk and Egyptian fleet in the Battle of Navarino, off the Peloponnese Peninsula. But the deciding moment came when Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1828. And the Ottoman Turks turned their attention to fighting the Russians. The following year, the Egyptians withdrew from Greece. In March 1830 the London Protocol was signed by Britain, France, and Russia, recognizing an independent Greece. Weary from the fighting, the Ottoman Turks accepted the terms of the proclamation later that year.
What was Thomas Cavendish's claim to fame?
English navigator Thomas Cavendish, c. 1560–1592, followed in Sir Francis Drake's, 1540 or 1543–1596, footsteps. Seeing Drake return from his exploits at sea and against the Spanish, Cavendish was inspired. And it was for good reason. Drake had earned himself fame, wealth, and the honor of being knighted. So in 1586 Cavendish set out with 3 ships for Brazil, made it through the Strait of Magellan, and then proceeded to capture Spanish treasure including their prized ship, the Santa Ana. The kings of Spain later mourned the loss and the fact that the ship had been taken by an English youth, with 40 or 50 companions. Cavendish, now in the Pacific, continued his voyage, which took him to the Philippines, Moluccas, and Java before he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Africa, and returned home. The journey had taken 2 years and 50 days, cost him 2 of his own ships, and made him the third person to circumnavigate the globe. But his welcome in England was not what he expected. Cavendish was received with acclaim, but was not knighted by the Queen. The fame and fortune that had come his way quickly vanished. He spent most of his new money, and his renown soon faded. By 1590 Cavendish thought he would try the journey again. Setting sail with 5 ships in August 1591, the fleet was headed for trouble. Having made it to South America, heavy storms separated the ships as they attempted to make their way through the Strait of Magellan. The ship Cavendish captained turned back toward Brazil, attempting to make landfall. But Cavendish himself never made it. He died en route, believing he had been deserted by his mates.
What were the French holdings in the New World?
The French possessions in North America, called New France, consisted of the colonies of Canada, Acadia, and Louisiana. The first land claims were made in 1534 by French explorer Jacques Cartier. 1491 to 1557, as he sailed the St. Lawrence River in eastern Canada. In 1604 Sieur de Mons, Pierre Dugois, c. 1568 c. 1630, established a settlement at Acadia. In present-day Nova Scotia, Canada, and French claims later extended the region to include what are today the province of New Brunswick and the eastern part of the state of Maine. After founding Quebec in 1608, explorer Samuel de Champlain, c. 1567 to 1635, penetrated the interior, present-day Ontario, as far as Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, extending French land claims westward. In 1672 French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet, 1645 to 1700, and French missionary Jacques Marquette, 1637 to 1675, became the first Europeans to discover the upper part of the Mississippi River. 10 years later, French explorer Sieur de La Salle, 1643 to 1687, followed the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the river valley for France and naming it Louisiana. While the French expanded their North American claims, the majority of French settlers lived in Canada. France lost Canada to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. Louisiana changed hands numerous times before it was finally sold to the United States in 1803. As part of the Louisiana Purchase, it was France's last claim on the North American mainland. French culture and influence in these areas remains prevalent today. In 1635 the French also claimed the West Indies islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and its small surrounding islands, including Saint Barthélemy. In 1946 the French government changed the status of these islands from colonies to overseas departments.